So, how did you become interested in this question of what lay people think about human nature?
As a mechanism of humanity. So I became interested in that because, so most of my career I was interested in universal grammar and question of innateness, of innate knowledge. It was my impression that when I say go to a cocktail party and tell people about what they do, they look at me funny. I tried to figure out why they look at me funny. Why, to me, that looked completely natural. I mean, if you think about why you have two hands, or why you have this position for brain cancer, innateness there seems like a, completely plausible hypothesis. Why is it the case that when we think about syntax and innate knowledge, why that cannot be innate? Why it's only having two hands that can be innate? So to me, that seemed obvious, but it turns out that people don't think that this is obvious at all, and they thought that in fact even posing the question of innate knowledge is kind of absurd. It took me a while to kind of figure that that's really what's going on, and once I did, I figured, okay, let's find out, right? I'm a cognitive scientist, I have the tools to examine that, so let's see if people are in fact biased in this way, right? So the first thing is to test my intuitions. I think that they're looking at me funny. Is it really the case, right? Is it really the case that people think that knowledge cannot be innate? And if so, why that's the case? So I started running a few experiments. It turns out that that was the case. And I decided, okay, I need to write a book.
Right. Okay. So what are the findings? How are people systematically misled about human nature?
Right. So, again, I think that this is a huge accusation, right? That this is a huge bill to pause here. And this is particularly difficult to demonstrate precisely because scientists also debate on this question, right? So if you ask scientists, some of them will say there is no such thing as innate knowledge. So how do you go about that? So two ways. One way we went about that is simply focus on the facts. So present people with experiments, say with newborns. What newborns can and cannot do, these are facts. And then you can ask lay people to predict what would happen in these experiments and see what they would tell you and see whether people are systematically biased about what they think can and cannot be innate in newborn infants. And there you just have large body of evidence that you can contrast their intuitions with, what actually happens. So when you do so, people will tell you that, yes, newborn infants can, say, differentiate happy from sad faces, that facial emotions are innate. They have no problem with that. They think that, say, the capacity to sit and walk, even though the infant is not doing it right now, that is also innate. But when you ask them, will the infant understand that objects cannot move spontaneously, or that would they have a notion of numbers? So would they know that 3 lights and 3 sounds have a property, numeric property in common? And you tell them exactly how it was done. So you actually repeat the experiment as it was done and ask them to predict, what do you think infants would do? And then they tell you, no way. So when you ask people about sensory capacities about emotions, they volunteer that emotions, facial emotions, are innate. In fact, that's not the case. I should clarify. What's not the case is it's not the case that newborn infants can recognize facial emotions. At least so far, we have no evidence for that. Maybe facial emotions are innate. I think there is good reason to think that's the case, but recognition of facial emotions, that's not a scientific fact. But people are convinced that that is a fact. But when you ask them about innate knowledge, or at least the ability to recognize abstract number at birth, we know that infants can do that. People say that's not the case. So this is your first red light. Now, there might be other reasons about why people don't think that knowledge is innate. Maybe it's because they learned math at school and they think that, everything that has to do with knowledge has to be learned. That might contribute, but it does not explain what's going on. And it doesn't explain what's going on because when you look at why people are doing what they're doing, how they arrive at this decision, you see that the principles that drive their conclusions are completely messed up. And it's this faulty logic that makes you think that they are actually biased. So even if we don't ultimately know the answer about innateness, we still can show that the way people approach this problem is biased and is faulty.
Right, right. Just anecdotally, I completely find that to be the case. People always think emotions are innate. They have a really tough time accepting that emotions can be learned. Whereas on the other hand, they have a really, really tough time thinking knowledge can be innate. Like, to convince someone that you have numerosity as a capacity is really, really hard. People just don't accept it.
So that's exactly what the experiments show.
Okay, so then we can. So you talk about intuitive dualism and intuitive essentialism. So those are two kinds of camps that we can organize those findings under.
Yeah. So my claim is that our faulty conclusion arises from, it's kind of a perfect storm. So when we think about when people reasoning is guided by various set of principles that have very good reasons to exist. They have core knowledge of objects. They have core knowledge about the mind of other, and the two are distinct. So that gives rise to this notion of minds and bodies are separate. That gives rise to intuitive dualism, and there is a large evidence that people, in fact, are intuitive dualists. So that's one thing. People are also essentialist in the sense that they think that living things are what they are because there is some essence that they are born with. A dog is what is a dog because it's born with some doggy essence that it possesses. And there is further evidence that when people think about this essence, they believe it resides in the body of that creature.
Right.
Okay? So the literature about dualism and essentialism, there are two very large literatures that show that people are intuitive dualists and they are intuitive essentialists. What has not been previously recognized is that these two principles actually stand in conflict to each other. And they stand in conflict because when you come to reason about innateness, essentialism is talking and it's telling you, in order to figure out what's innate, you need to look at the body because the essence is in the body. But dualism tells you that knowledge isn't in the body. Knowledge is in the mind. That's what dualism is all about. So it follows from the collision between these two principles that knowledge cannot be innate. That's kind of the insight of the blind storyteller. And when we went to the lab and tested this model, it turns out that actually it is borne out by the results that that people are, in fact, when they reason about knowledge, they view it as ethereal, distinct from the body, more so than, say, emotions. That when people think about innateness, they think that what's innate must be in the body. And there was also evidence that those two principles interact. So I think there's good reason to think that the reason for our conclusions about what can and cannot be innate, they arise from these two principles of intuitive psychology. And that's really is the problem, right? Because this notion that knowledge is ethereal is obviously not in line with science. Essentialism also has some difficulties as a scientific doctrine, at least when it comes to explaining evolution. So it's the collision between these two principles is representing faulty ways of inference, and that's really what leads us astray when we think about innateness.
Evolution specifically, this might kind of just be a dumb question, but Evolution specifically, do you think that sort of the people knowing the conventions of evolution might contribute to them thinking of the body differently from the mind? Because I mean, to me, it's equally scientifically amazing that genes lead to bodily to bodily development as it is how language works in the mind, right? But the public education isn't there, where people know a little bit about how evolution works, but not a whole lot about how the brain works. Do you think that's kind of contributing at all?
Let me see if I understand. So you're saying that maybe the reason why people don't get innateness is because they understand evolution, but they don't understand the brain?
No. Just I'm talking about the specific idea of how people reason differently about the body and the mind.
Or how that idea arises, whether it has evolutionary origins?
Exactly, where people might use their sort of baseline understandings of evolution to reason one way about the body, and then the lack of baseline understandings about the mind to reason differently about the mind.
Well, you would only do so if you're a dualist, right? So it's because you're a dualist that you think about that the mind must obey different principles from the body. So indeed, you can understand evolution, but on top of that, you're a dualist, you would exactly arrive at that conclusion. So I think it implements this distinction rather than provides an alternative to it.
Right. People start at dualism. Okay.
Yeah. But I just want to clarify, I don't think that dualism per se is an evolutionary product, right? So I don't see any good reason for evolution to distinguish between bodies and mind. Rather, it's kind of, as I call it, a series of unfortunate events in the sense that, yes, evolution has interest in giving organisms the capacity to recognize objects, say the body of their mothers. Evolution might also have interest in giving humans the capacity to reason about the minds of others. That might be adaptive. Each of those capacities are adaptive. Together, they give us to dualism, but dualism itself has absolutely no...
I see. So those are both adaptive in their own right. It's just the unfortunate accident of having them both.
Yeah, exactly.
That leads to people thinking this way. That's really smart. Okay. The impact of this is you talk about how people incorrectly reason about mental disorders.
Yeah, among other things, right. So the whole notion of mental disorders, I was always wondering, what are people talking about when they talk about mental disorder? And is it physical or is it mental? I mean, what could it possibly mean? What am I not understanding here? It turns out that this dualism actually also kind of is the heart of how people reason about mental disorders, unfortunately. So, at the beginning of this century, or actually the end of the 20th century, there was this attempt to, let's educate the public. Let's try to fight stigma there's a lot of stigma, obviously, concerning mental disorders. Let's try to fight the stigma by telling people, listen, this is a physical problem like all other problems. And in fact, it did not fight the stigma, and it did not abolish the stigma in some ways. So there are really mixed results. There are some results that suggest that if you believe that a person's disease is caused by their body, they are not freely willing the symptoms, then perhaps they're not responsible for them. On the other hand, if their body is so different to yours that they include this innate disorder, then maybe you don't want to marry them, and maybe, right? So you distance from them. So the question, but we try to understand a little more why that's the case, that invoking the brain. So the question was whether it's specifically this notion of invoking the brain that actually caused the stigma. So we did experiments such as telling people that here is this person that have symptoms of depression, and they come to the clinic and they're getting a test for to diagnose them, and the test either looks at their behavior, so through some behavioral procedure, say how you respond to happy faces versus sad faces, and look at how fast people respond pressing a button, or look at some brain wave that happens in response to the same procedure. So the information that you get in both cases is exactly the same, and people are told in both cases, if you respond, say, faster to happy faces, then we know you don't have depression. If you don't, you do. The results people are told are exactly the same. The information that's obtained by the same test is exactly the same. But then when you ask people, why is the person like that? Were they born this way? Would you like to have your sister marry them? And so forth. They tell you that when the result, excuse me, sorry, when the result is obtained by the brain test, then people are more likely to think that the disorder is innate, and they also are more, they have more stigma. They are less likely to accept this person as, say, a marriage partner and so forth. This is only explained by dualism, right? Because why would you interpret the brain results differently from behavioral results when they're informatively exactly equivalent? It looks like people attribute to the brain, first, they consider the brain different to information that does not speak to the body directly. And furthermore, perhaps because they're essentialists, they think that if it's in the brain, it's therefore going to speak to your essence. And therefore, you better, not marry this person and kind of, yeah. So, and that's very unfortunate. I mean, that's extremely a serious and concerning result.
Yeah, I mean, mental disorders, it's such a broad term. We don't know what to include in the umbrella of it. But is there sort of homogeneity there where people think the same way about, say, dyslexia as they do about dementia? Or
no, they don't.
They don't.
Okay. So there are several distinctions to draw there. First, among those, the ones that people usually consider the real mental disorders, say people don't think about dyslexia as a mental disorder, a psychiatric disorder, even though technically it is, but they think about, say, depression as a mental disorder, schizophrenia as a mental disorder, and people treat them differently to dyslexia. Dyslexia, we actually, you get the opposite result. So when you ask people about dyslexia, they typically think that if you ask a person why Johnny has problems reading, the 6-year-old, they tell you, oh, it's all letter confusion, they skip letters. That's actually not factually correct. So letter confusions happen to young children across the board, regardless of whether or not they have the dyslexia. The characteristics of dyslexia, what defines dyslexia, well, I should step back and say dyslexia is very heterogeneous. There are many types of dyslexia with many origins, but in most cases, what you find most frequently are problems with processing speech sounds. So it's not in vision, it's not in, our intuition says that dyslexia is all a visual problem, but in fact, the problems that you see in dyslexia, because remember, the link to the language and how this is hijacking the brain pathways for speech and language. The problems actually are in speech processing. And in fact, you find them if you look at infants who are at risk for dyslexia because their parents, dyslexia runs in families. So if you look at very young infants whose families have dyslexia, their speech perception is already significantly different to controls. But lay people don't think that's the case. So either they think that if they think that dyslexia is really a serious disorder, then think it must be visual because only sensory capacities can be innate. Right. Whereas if you tell them what dyslexia really is, which is really a problem in decoding sound letters, they think, oh, this might be this ethereal thing that is that cannot be really innate because it's not in the body and therefore it's not as serious. So the misconceptions about dyslexia and, say, depression are opposite. In depression, people run to the conclusion that because you can kind of you think it shows up in the face, and because it's emotional, it must be innate and in the body, whereas in dyslexia, as soon as you think about what it really is, which has to do with mapping letters to sounds and knowledge, then you think, oh, that must be something that's completely, learned and not something that's innate.
I see. What about something like schizophrenia?
So schizophrenia, we found the same results, although because the disease is so severe, there, people tend to think about it regardless of how you present them as innate. But when you look at them, manipulate this with a more sensitive procedure, as we did, you do find the same findings.
So then, if telling the public that it's all physical didn't really work out, what is the kind of right way to be communicating this?
So maybe we don't know. Yeah. I think it's an empirical question what works. But if I had to guess, I would say perhaps making people aware of their biases, know thyself, right? Maybe that would bring some insight, hopefully, but remains to be seen.